are allowed to think big and dream big. How to generate different systems. Systems that provide stability and are nested within the harmony of nature. I'm excited to explore with you the intriguing bandwidth of information our researchers and friends have surfaced. Let's dive into our next topic to find out how we can actively shape a future worth pursuing and living for.
When in the hands of kings, generals, heads of state, this tool has changed the course of history. Pirates and explorers used it to locate their treasures all over the seven seas. And now it has been passed down to you to replicate the greatness of your ancestors. Oh, wait, stop. You're telling me that you're no general? Not even an explorer? Okay. So what are you using maps for? Checking out the pizza places in the area. Fair enough. Actually, if you have any recommendation, because I would always like to try some new places better. Well, hello, and welcome to another episode of System Change, the podcast by the Master of Global Change Management at the University for Sustainable Development of Eberswalde. My name is Francesca, and I'll be your host for today's episode, where we'll explore the power of maps and critical cartography. Before we start, I have to ask you a question that might seem simple, but don't let it fool you. Can you recognize a map when you see one? Well, let me tell you, apparently that is not always the case, at least according to the results of a questionnaire I sent out to a bunch of friends. And I know, of course, this is by no means a statistically relevant group. Who actually has that many friends? But anyway, what the questionnaire did was giving me an idea of how maps were perceived in my friends group. A first section showed them different types of maps, some carved in stone, some more artistic, and some other a bit more familiar and standard. And with no surprise, this third group has been the most recognized, confirming two of my main hypotheses. That's to say that we only have a narrow idea of what a map can look like. And secondly, but most importantly, that my friends are quite simple creatures. And to further prove my hypothesis, I created a second section of the questionnaire in which my friends had to rate 5 different maps from best to worst without knowing anything about them and following only their own perception. And also this time, the maps rated as the best were actually the ones with which my friends were more familiar with. For example, the Mercator projection that is using Google Maps. But this time, something actually surprised me, because I was not expecting Google Maps to be considered only second best, with the first place taken by a rather quirky, upside-down, stretched-looking hobo-dyer projection. But once again, the most different-looking maps had been disregarded by most of my friends. I hope that now you start understanding why I don't want to be friends with them anymore. Anyway, when asked to explain their choices, the topic of precision was on the top 3 motivations, together with the already cited familiarity and the amount of information that could be retrieved from the map without knowing anything about it. But what does critical cartography has to do with precision and we're maps? Let's start by addressing the concept of precision. We tend to consider a map precise when its geometry is correct, when all the distances, measurements, and shapes are a perfect representation of the real world. But I have a few philosophers like Plato on my side that will call you out even for saying perfect representation. Because a representation, by nature, can only be similar to the real thing. It can never be perfect. It can only be relatively accurate. But also my buddy Schopenhauer agrees with me when I say that the world is my representation, and following this logic, a map is a physical representation of a subjective representation of the world. Did I already say representation? And don't even get me started on the various compromises that you have to accept when creating a map. A first one is the reduction scale, that is fundamental unless you want to create a map as wide as the actual surface of the Earth. Another one is the geometric projection of your choice. And if you think that this cannot be controversial because, come on, it's just geometry, try asking the people in the 70s what they thought about the Peters world map that stretched the continents showing the more accurate size. And while you're at it, ask yourself why a map showing Africa and South America bigger than Europe and North America, as they are, was perceived controversial. Can it be related to some latent Western-centric colonialism? Nah, it can't be. Or can it? This leads to one last compromise for today: the use of a map. In fact, each representation serves a different scope, whether it's showing a national railway network or a lake or your favorite pizza places in the neighborhood. Also, the level of detail has to be defined. You cannot include every single detail. Something will be necessarily left out. I mean, we have to prioritize. To put it differently, I like to compare the world to a huge dictionary, and each person has a different one with different words in it. When we want to express something, we pick the words we want to use from said dictionary, adapting our choices depending on who we are, what we want to communicate, to which type of person, in which occasion, and so on. We could then decide to pick some ambiguous words on purpose to confuse the recipient of the message. Or even worse, we can omit some crucial details because we don't think they're important. Well, they can be for somebody else. This metaphor serves us to understand that maps could be like statements, or even better, manifestos, formed by different elements accurately chosen to convey a certain message from a certain point of view. So not only what is being said is important, but also how and by whom. And that's where critical cartography steps in with its revolutionary message. First of all, the movement accepts the relativity of maps and embraces it to the max. Secondly, artists and activists started to question and critique the way things were presented through conventional maps, proposing alternative visions of the power dynamics of a territory. To fully understand the revolutionary power of the critical cartography movement, we have to consider that throughout the centuries, cartography and mapmaking were actually a field for only a few people that had a specific set of knowledge and skills. But one of the most prolific use of mapmaking was, of course, to depict as precisely as possible all the relevant aspects of a territory, in order to guide armies through enemy fields, plan war strategies, or push explorers and conquerors even further in their expeditions. For a long time, map-making was a state matter. On the one hand, because the various governments had the resources and the authority needed for the creation of maps. And on the other hand, because maps were mostly perceived as a technical tool for state affairs and administration. This ideal made possible for a small academic and military elite to have control on how territories were represented, holding the power of maps all for themselves and using it for their often colonialist aims. Thanks to critical cartographers, there has been a shift in this idea, and as Crampton and Kreiger defined it in their introduction to critical cartography, cartography is now being undisciplinized by artists and activists, and by depicting wonkier shapes, modifying the size of continents, and not really caring about a consistent reduction scale or proportions, critical mappers challenge the status quo of what a map should look like, with bold statements, revealing that every map has a point of view and it's never neutral. It always has a goal or an aim. So this flooding of opportunity sparked the creativity of people from all over the world that started to use maps as an art medium or even as a political statement to present alternative narratives of the territory, shifting the point of view from the top down of the state to the bottom up of the people. On top of that, critical mappers managed to include issues that had been overlooked by those official maps by creating, for example, community-owned maps about police brutality, indigenous maps, or even emotional maps of cities, making emerging issues visible for the first time and therefore impossible to ignore any further. And since critical maps refuse to adhere to the rules of conventional maps, they manage a great expressive freedom, making the combination of medium, colors, and symbols potentially endless. If I managed to spark some interest in you and you want to discover more about critical cartography, check out the additional resources linked in the description of this episode. And if you've reached this point of the podcast, I have to thank you for sticking around and spending time with me in this first step into the metaphysical dimension of maps, filled with geometry and philosophy concepts, weird questionnaires, even weirder friends. And I know there will be so much more I would like to tell you, but for now, I would like to say goodbye to you using an expression by Dennis Wood, one of the most relevant map artists. The map is dead. Long live the map.